Good afternoon. I'm going to call the special council meeting of May 21st, 2012 to order. Will you please rise with me for the Pledge of Allegiance? Thank you. Please call the roll.
Councilmember Francisco Hotchkiss. Here. House. Murillo. Here. Rouse. White. Mayor Schneider.
Here. And I don't see any public comment slips for items not on the agenda. Is that correct? Okay, so we'll just move on to the item if you want to read it.
State Route 225 relinquishment update.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the City Council. We are here to follow up on the May 1st, 2012 council meeting on the State Route 225 relinquishment from Caltrans to the City of Santa Barbara. Just as a reminder, the limits of the corridor under discussion go from Cliff Drive and Las Positas from Castillo Street to U.S. Highway 101. It's approximately 4.6 of principal arterial, 4.6 miles of principal arterial. On May 1st, the council considered the proposed relinquishment of this corridor by Caltrans to the city. And during that presentation, staff covered the information relative to costs, liability, interests in enhancements that might be appropriate to support pedestrian and vehicular mobility in a safer way. We've included the council agenda report from that meeting in your packet. We are here today to follow up on questions that were asked during that meeting. Council requested information primarily around what it would take to make the corridor safer and what improvements to pedestrian and vehicular mobility along particularly Cliff Drive might be viable, and what kind of cost we would be looking at, potential for phasing, and whether or not grant funding might be a possibility for the types of projects that would be required. So since staff has not had responsibility, this is a state highway, we don't have a background of information relative to this corridor that allows us to more quickly get into the specific responses that were asked of us by council. So we've put together a work plan that would identify the steps we would logically go through to be able to develop the information and support recommendations that we could make along these lines. The brief outline of the bullets that are identified on this slide include identifying trends and patterns of accident history to determine critical targets for safety improvements, identify potential phased safety-oriented improvements that are viable upon a future relinquishment of SR 225 to the city, including cost estimates and expected timelines, report on how traffic operations have changed or improved since Caltrans restriping, including a speed analysis and additional analysis of the accident claim history and related issues. I'll go over these in a bit more detail, but on bullet item 3, anecdotally we've heard that the speed along the route with the restriping to the 2 travel lane center turn lane have caused people to drive slower and have ameliorated some of the concerns that people in the area previously had. Caltrans has indicated they would not go through an update of the speed study to determine whether or not a reconsideration of the current posted speed of 40 miles an hour would be warranted. We took a quick snapshot. Last Thursday, we looked at the corridor and identified the areas most logical for doing a speed analysis. The last Caltrans speed study was done in 2007, and it supported the 40-mile-an-hour speed limit. It was about 41 miles an hour for the 85th percentile. When we did this quick snapshot, which would not constitute a full speed survey to be considered What we found was the speeds were roughly 4 miles an hour faster. So the 85th percentile in each direction was just over 44 miles an hour. So not knowing what the speeds might have been prior to the restriping, this could indeed be an improvement. But based on the 2007 study and comparing it to just that snapshot, it does not appear that there would be a real opportunity if we were to engage in a more thorough speed survey to justify reducing the speed limit at this point. So we wanted to just take a quick grab to see if indeed there was some likelihood of justification for consideration. And as I said, this is a snapshot, but it still is at least a check-in with what is actually going on in the corridor in terms of
Mr.
speed.
White has a question.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Ms. Anderson, would there be a difference on speed limits, analysis, et cetera, between state and local jurisdiction on this?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember White, no, there would not. We are obligated to follow state statutes in the survey analysis that's necessary to establish a speed limit. So looking at the specifics on the updated summary and analysis of accident history on State Route 225, this is a kind of baseline element of being able to look at the type of accident considerations that we would want to be trying to address with a capital improvement project. And it is challenging. We have had some shifting, as you may realize, in previous council agenda reports and the one that we presented to you on May 1st. The state accident reporting information is a capture of the reports that are provided. And those reports are not heavily standardized. So what tends to happen is the information gets included in the state structure, but to generate a report back to identify what types of accidents and where they're located can be challenging because oftentimes there are mistakes in the way the spelling for street names is identified. For example, in the city, we have roughly 900 streets. And if you look at the Switters report, the state accident report, they show 3,000 street names. So there are some duplications, obviously, that are captured as unique because the spelling is different. So as we've gone through and tried to provide information about what the accident characteristics along this corridor look like, if you run a report that just pulls the 225 accidents along Cliff and Las Positas, it pops up about 200. If you scrub them and really pull out the improperly written names and locations, which we did prior to your March 1st meeting, it's more like 600 to 700 accidents that are reflected along that corridor. So what that tells us is there's information that we would really need to be spending time going through and analyzing to determine what kinds of accidents are occurring, what's potentially causing them, what kinds of treatments or capital projects would likely improve the situation. So that's a little bit of background so you can understand the level of effort to be able to really answer your questions. And then identifying whether phased safety improvements would be possible or whether you really need to have combinations of projects in order to improve the conditions, especially for pedestrian mobility, is something that we want to be able to do as a follow-on to understanding what's actually happening out there right now. And then the cost estimates and the types of funding that might be available. Because there's safety issues, we would look for safety improvement funding, but the relative merit of these projects compared to the other types of projects that we would have, for example, in the city, is kind of a chicken and the egg because there are not as many pedestrian movements in this area. We would likely have other intersections that would rank better for highway safety improvement funds because there are existing pedestrian movements and needs. So it's not a black and white issue of once we develop a project list, we would have an opportunity to tap into existing funds. So that's a pretty high-level summary. The other expectation of time frame, because we do have a pretty significant workload for the staff that would be involved in doing this investigation, without taking everybody completely off of those other work areas, we would need to balance this into our existing workload and looking at probably 6 to 9 months to be able to go through the analysis steps and to identify potential projects. The opportunity to have some of this legwork done with consultants or extra staff resource if we had $15,000 to $30,000 of time that could be allocated to additional resource, that might cut it back to the 6 months as opposed to the 9 months. And then this is not expected to allow any kind of public outreach. This would be a strictly staff-driven internal data analysis and viability of types of projects, type of exercise. So that's our quick description. Then the options for council direction for next steps on this include moving forward with the relinquishment without the preparation of the proposed work plan identified, move forward with the relinquishment in parallel with the preparation of the work plan, move forward with preparation of the work plan and return to council for direction on how to proceed with relinquishment, postpone the relinquishment until there's a better economic outlook for achieving community goals, or tabling the relinquishment for further action. So there are, as you can see, myriad permutations of options at this point. And we have an updated photo, so I wanted to be sure and show that. But we're available for questions.
Thank you. Questions? I also want to acknowledge Eileen Lowe from Caltrans District 5 is here, and Hillary Blackerby from Assemblymember Williams' office is here in case there are questions for them. Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. When you were talking about this study, you got any idea how many man-hours we're talking about? My real question is this going to keep the staff from doing other stuff we should be doing?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, I don't have an actual labor hours kind of ability at this point. I think in part it's going to be understanding how clear or how intuitive the ability to identify what's causing the particular accident problems and what might be viable approaches to being able to address them. So it will be kind of a step-by-step analysis. But yes, this will have an impact on our workload.
Sure. And one of the things that you stated elsewhere was that naturally if we did take this, it would draw from other areas of maintenance in the city, as it were. You follow what I'm saying?
Yes.
So in essence, we're sort of saying the same thing with staff here, that it's going to take up some time that otherwise can be. Okay, thank you.
Ms. Murillo?
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor. Thank you for your presentation. Ms. Anderson, could you use some of the planning documents that have been put together by the Mesa community? And maybe we'll hear about that during public comment, because I think they've done some studying of their intersections there.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Murillo, we would certainly look at the work that's been done by the Mesa architects and the community group. But I think the focus on trying to identify the charge that we have taken on as a staff response has really been to try to identify safety projects that would enhance both the mobility for pedestrians, but also, given the accident statistics, mobility for all modes of transport as well on this corridor. So we would certainly want to take a look at the work that had been done, but we would do it in a pretty much analytical way and would not intend to try and develop a collaborative work plan of proposed projects.
And in your the issue of the proposed work plan, So, and maybe this goes to Mr. Hotchkiss' question, it would take you away from general planning?
Councilwoman Murillo, it would take us away from more of the traffic analysis response. Our operations staff would be the ones primarily working on this type of an analysis. So any of the, we have a pretty full work plan of already identified safety areas of concern throughout the city that we are picking away at, and this would get rolled into that.
When we were talking about the Milpas Street improvements, we had agreed that there would be an overall review as part of the general plan. So you're saying that's all part of the workload?
Madam Mayor, Councilwoman Murillo, the type of neighborhood plan that you were mentioning for the Milpas area would involve more of the transportation planning staff as well as operations, because we would be looking at a much more comprehensive type of evaluation of that neighborhood. This was strictly limited to capital projects tied to accident reduction.
Okay, I see the difference. When Milpas Street used to be a state highway, and we took it over in 98 or 99. I tried to do a little research. Maybe John, or
yes,
Mr. Owaziak.
Yes, Mr. Owaziak is mentioning to me, I think there were only a couple of blocks that were actually state highway. It didn't go all the way into the city.
Okay. But when we took it over, it didn't look like Cliff Drive does now, with hardly any traffic signals and improvements, right?
I couldn't speak to that.
Any historians in the audience?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Murillo, there were no city street improvements as a result of the relinquishment of that portion of Milpas. I believe is it Montecito Street? Anyway, from the trap roundabout up a few blocks, and then it went towards is it Mason? Mason, thank you. And then it went towards the roundabout, and so there was a partial relinquishment of that route.
That Highway 144? Or what was that? What that was?
Yes.
Was Highway 144? Okay.
And then just another question. You were talking about street names being incorrect. So when you start looking at Milpas, the Milpas corridor, that will also be an issue, right? To really nail down where the accidents are and that kind of thing.
Madam Mayor, Councilwoman Murillo, actually, because that's a city facility, we devote more effort to trying to sort through and understand that information. We just have not taken that on as a requirement of city staff for the State Route 225 under Caltrans jurisdiction. Since it's not our jurisdictional responsibility, we have not spent the time doing that. And frankly, it's not terribly surprising that the state hasn't either. With the number of state facilities, it does take a lot of man hours to go through and do that kind of clarification of statistics.
Thank you. And thank you, Mayor Schneider.
Mr. Bass?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So, Ms. Anderson, I was a little concerned about some of the traffic stats and kind of the confusion with the data and whatnot. And we haven't really had the new striping plan in place for all that long. So it'd be fair to say, I mean, of course, anecdotally, you were used earlier on, people seem to sense some kind of a calming, although your stats didn't really bear that out. But I would think as well, statistically, not crossing 4 lanes of traffic and now having a dedicated turn lane, I would think would have some kind of a mitigating effect on some of those issues. It's just that it hasn't been around long enough for us to really have the data. Is that correct?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rouse, 2 things. One, this is the type of information we would be trying to glean from going through and actually analyzing the accident statistics to see if there have been trends, if there have been changes over the time period that we have this documentation, to see if there were improvements that were made that resulted in a reduction for periods of time. The roughly a year since the restriping was done means that we've got a delay in being able to get access to some of that potential accident information, so we would be looking at trying to capture that as well. But trends, it's a short window of time for a real trend, but we would certainly be wanting to look at that.
All right. Well, thank you.
Mr. White?
Okay, Madam Mayor. Safety improvement funding. Where does that come from? And what would be the candidates in the city now that would rise to near the top of the pile? Like one or two just examples.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember White, probably it's a program that's administered through Caltrans, and it is one of the candidate pools that we looked at specifically for Milpas. While it may or may not be one that we want to try and engage in because of the lead time, it's the type of project that we saw as appropriate for the Milpas analysis that would fit well in the Highway Safety Improvement Program category, both in terms of the cost of the projects involved and also the ranking relative to pedestrian and vehicle movements. So that's probably a good example.
Where would the money start? Where would it sprout, and
Federal.
then where would it grow?
It's a federal highway funding program that's administered through Caltrans.
Okay, so then the state of California gets a bag of money from the feds and then distributes it to local jurisdictions.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember White, yes, that's a good way of describing it. It's got criteria that you must address as part of the competitive process, but it is distributed statewide.
Thanks. I don't know if this question's for you or maybe for Ms. Lowe in terms of one of your recommendations or one of your options, I guess, is moving forward in parallel with preparation of the work plan and just trying to see what the timing of that. I remember from the May 1st meeting, relinquishment would take a minimum of 14 to 18 months, and you're saying the work plan would take 6 to 9 months. And I guess the question is, if, let's say, we chose that option to work in parallel and we find at the end of the work plan some brand new information that was just, people wanted to change direction at that point, is there opportunity to do so, or, is the train left the station, I guess, is the one way to look at it. I mean, there is a final vote after, to actually sign the documents for relinquishment. Are there any other, if you can remind me if there are any other portions along the way where we have to check in for something like that?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Actually, I think we do have that. Maybe we don't have that. Yes. This is the 14 to 18-month relinquishment process that we had shared earlier. One of the options, if we were to, if the City Council decided to move forward with the relinquishment process today, but wanted to see the time frame for, at the completion of relinquishment, the city being in a position to have a clear understanding of what opportunities might exist to be able to make improvements along the corridor, that would be the rationale for choosing that option. And as part of the PSSR, the Project Scope Summary Report, Caltrans will be identifying potentially some of the information that could be included in the work that staff would be doing to respond to the questions from Council. So that we would work collaboratively with Caltrans staff on the work that they would be doing for the PSSR, and that we wouldn't have to duplicate as part of the city staff analysis. And it would stretch the timeline, once again, to be able to work into our work plan without significant impact to the other priorities for the city related to traffic operations. So that's the nexus for that
Thank you.
kind of an approach.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll move to public comment. I have actually, I want to check to see if Ms. Lowe or Ms. Blackerby have anything that you'd like to say at this point. Okay.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, members of the council. I would just like to take an opportunity to clarify some points on accident statistics. As you know, all numbers are relative. We have run the numbers for the accident statistics that we have available through our state records, and the indication about other accident records that may not be matriculated into the state system may have something to do with whether or not collisions were recorded as being on a state highway facility. And we simply request that those collision records be provided to us. We're happy to update and we have an obligation to keep our records up to date. So any collision records that your city staff could provide to us, we would put into our database. Absent that information, the TASIS, we refer to it as the TASIS report, that's an acronym for a database that we use. The corridor as a whole operates well. The collisions are below the statewide average for routes of a similar nature and type around the state. Furthermore, there are about 35 intersections throughout the corridor as well. And at most of those intersections, the operation is also the collision rate is at or below the statewide average. On those few intersections where we do note a little bit of a blip above the statewide average, our safety engineer has said it's really not statistically significant. So overall, the route operates well. And that it's not to say that it's accident-free, but it operates well. Just happy to say there aren't any skeletons in the closet here that we're not coming forward with. We've shared this information with your staff, and I'm happy to answer any questions, but I just wanted to clarify that point. And, of course, we would work with you on any proposal that you come forward with. It would be helpful to us if this council were to make a deliberate decision on whether or not to proceed. There are those steps where there's a cooperative agreement that would come in probably about 6 months' time before there would be a final recordation of the deed and that kind of thing. But we'd really like to proceed with some intent and good faith effort and not be waiting for more work and then another decision about maybe this, maybe that. We really would just like some clear direction from you. So appreciate your deliberation today, and I know you want to hear from others. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move on. We'll start with Angela Bell, and to be followed by Holly Tatomer. Or who's giving your time to you? Is Holly here? There you are. There you are. So you have 4 minutes.
Mayor Schneider and City Council. First, I would like to give you each one of these. It's a history of the Mesa, and it's then and now. So I just would like to do that. And there's a few points that I would like to make. I'm speaking for the 107 people that live at Schiffco. I also have a letter from the Housing Authority that I would like to read. So I'm also speaking for them. It says, Dear Mayor Schneider and members of the City Council, as you know, the Housing Authority owns a large 107 units low-income senior housing development in the 400 block of Cliff Drive known as Schiffco. The resident council at Schiffco has long advocated for traffic improvements, calming actions on Cliff Drive, and both the Housing Authority Commission and staff have supported their advocacy over the years. Many of the residents, due to age and limited income, walk and use the bus. And just so that you know, the bus stop is across the street from Schiffco. So when somebody gets off the bus there, they have to go through 4 lanes of traffic. As pedestrians, a number of Schiffco residents have encountered numerous close calls with automobiles that travel Cliff Drive at high rates of speed. The residents have shared with the Housing Authority their happiness about the lane reduction and other traffic improvements that have been recently made to Cliff Drive. They want to see these kinds of improvements continue, but feel can only be assured through the city's stewardship of Cliff Drive. To that end, the Schiffco residents have asked the Housing Authority to provide your council this letter supporting the city's acceptance of Cliff Drive from the state. I have a copy of the letter for each council member. I also have a letter from the Free Methodist Church on behalf of the Free Methodist Church of Santa Barbara and the larger Mesa community. I would ask that you vote to take ownership and control of Cliff Drive from Caltrans. Our congregation has been pleased by the work already done over the past year to increase safety on the east side of the road. However, we do feel more work could be done. Crosswalks are truly necessary, not only for people who park across from our church on Sunday mornings, but for the seniors at the city Shifco housing community who often cross the street to use the bus stop recently moved to Arcona. So I did hear something, if I'm not mistaken, about not very much pedestrian crossing. I mean, we are the only neighborhood in the city that has 3 elementary schools, 2 churches, a senior complex, and a synagogue, all facing Cliff Drive. I don't think there is another neighborhood that has those statistics. So far, the city has not paid anything to keep its residents along Cliff Drive safe. There has been nada money spent. I just would like to read a little piece
You have 10,
that the
about
Mesa
13
architects-
seconds.
It'll take 2 seconds. Milpas from Canapedito to Carpinteria is 0.9 miles, 12 intersections, 20 painted crosswalks, 8 traffic lights, a speed limit of 30 miles an hour, and a recent city commitment to further pedestrian improvements, $252,000.
Okay, thank you.
From Cliff Drive to Meigs to Loma Alta, 1.2 miles, 14 intersections.
Isabel, that's a very long 2 minutes, 2 seconds.
Well,
You're way over your time, so.
and a 40-mile speed limit, and so far, the city has made no commitment to the residents, who are also, by the way, taxpayers.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry to go over.
That's all right. I understand. I get it. I get it. Wayne Tustin will be followed by John Kelly. Wayne? Is Wayne not here? Okay. John? And you have Jim Bell. Jim here. There you are. And Chris Cottrell? Okay, there you are. So you have 6 minutes, Mr. Kelly.
Madam Mayor, council members, I'm John Kelly, a Mesa resident, and I'm here supporting the transfer of State Route 225 to the city. So a key factor in the safety of a neighborhood is how its main street works. Many of Santa Barbara's neighborhoods have main streets. For downtown and the north side, it's State Street. For the east side, it's Milpas. For the west side, it's San Andreas. Cliff Drive is the main street of the Mesa neighborhood. Local control is needed to allow safety improvements for drivers and pedestrians, including school children, seniors, and people who attend church. On May 1st, you all agreed that local control of Cliff Drive is needed. However, some concerns about cost and liability were raised. Please remember that the takeover of State Route 225 will add less than 3% to the road area that the city is responsible for. So additional maintenance cost and liability will be very modest in relation to existing city obligations. Regarding safety improvements, we realize that the timing of improvements will depend on the availability of funding. However, we remain optimistic that significant safety improvements can be implemented at low cost in the near future. Postponing takeover of SR 225 would waste more than 10 years of community advocacy, and more than 4 years of time and effort by city and state officials. The relinquishment process must be continued so Mesa residents can work with the city over time to improve safety for local residents and visitors. At the end of the day, today's budget challenges will be forgotten. What will be remembered is whether or not you did the right thing for the long-term well-being of our community. Be on the right side of history. Just say yes. Thank you very much.
Leslie Wiscombe will be followed by Laurel Perez.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor and members of the City Council. My name's Leslie Wiscombe, and I'm a Mesa resident. On July 18th, 2006, the City Council unanimously supported adoption of the Santa Barbara Pedestrian Master Plan. The master plan includes a section on the Cliff Drive corridor which states, and I quote, "It lacks continuous sidewalks, has high-speed vehicles, and is difficult to cross. The roadway should be relinquished to the city for control of higher quality intersection crossings and potential addition of a median to calm travel speeds." And in an exhibit map in the master plan that proposes short-term improvements as recommended by engineers Penfield and Smith, 3 points are cited on Cliff Drive that are east of Meigs, where installations of zebra-striped crosswalks are recommended, while advanced stop bars are recommended at the intersection of Cliff and Meigs. All of these recommendations are paint on the ground. In January 2012, you made a decision regarding pedestrian improvements at De La Vina and Figueroa, a project that received a $251,000 HISP grant. The staff report for that meeting stated, and I quote, "Progressively increasing the level of traffic control is consistent with good traffic engineering practices. Initial steps are usually low cost, and painted crosswalks and warning signs are a reasonable first step to improve pedestrian crossing conditions," unquote. Again, paint on the ground. The majority of Mesa residents do not expect that relinquishment will be followed by high-end improvements that cost a big pot of money, but rather by reasonable first steps, as said in that staff report. Our residents urge the city to commit to a plan that includes analysis of potential solutions, funding opportunities including grants for both planning and construction, and over time, implementation of safety measures as warranted. Please continue to proceed with city control of SR 225 as recommended in the pedestrian master plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Laurel Perez will be followed by Alice San Andres Calleja.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, council members. I think that you all agree that Cliff Drive should one day be a city street. With more than 4 years of effort that has gone into the negotiations that have brought us to this point, I think all parties negotiating in good faith, a lot of money has been recently spent by Caltrans to bring Cliff Drive, Las Positas up to its current standards, issues being whittled away. To stop now, short of moving forward with relinquishment, I think would be a huge waste of effort, time, money, resources that have already been spent. To pick it up again one day in the future is going to require a redo of a lot of what has already brought us to this point. We all recognize that financially times are very tough, straining. You have very difficult decisions in front of you. And the kinds of safety improvements that we expect if the city were to take over Cliff Drive are certainly tempered by the financial times that we're in today. You heard Leslie just speak about paint on the asphalt. Simple things like crosswalks that could be painted to help children get across safely Cliff Drive with a crossing guard. Something that is very difficult to achieve on a state highway under Caltrans' current ownership. Maybe paint on the ground and some additional safety improvements near Shifco. But these are very simple measures that could happen with city local control of Cliff that we're not going to have an opportunity to achieve with Caltrans. If not now, when? And keep in mind that there are simple safety measures that we hope that Public Works staff could pursue in their study. If you think that I think it was called the work plan, is an important factor to continuing to move this forward, my recommendation to you is that that would occur concurrently with the continued relinquishment effort that is underway. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Alice. And then David Van Hoy Alice, come on up. And then it'll be Nick Sebastian and then Hillary Blackerby.
Thank you, members of the City Council. You know, I hate petitions, but I went around and get signatures just to show you. And my first statement is always, do you know that Cliff Drive is a state highway? Huh? You know, it's to my mind, it's an anachronism. It does not belong. The city and the state has allowed our community. SR 225 was okay when it was the hinterlands, when nobody wanted to go to the mesa. But you have allowed it to develop into a full community. 3 elementary schools, the city college, a senior housing, 3 churches and a synagogue. The business center is there. So I think there's a way. I always believe, and I said this before, miracles are an undeniable part of human dreams. We're together with this. The Mesa has a history of pulling together. We made possible Shoreline Park and Douglas Family Preserve. So I think we just have to be positive. Funding is always an issue in every government project. I think it will come. If you can see it in your mind's eye, it will happen. We work at it as a community. So that's all I can say.
Thank you. Give that to the clerk. Thank you.
900 signatures. Thank you.
David Van Hoy.
Madam Mayor and council members, I'm David Van Hoy. I'm here to express my support for the city and Caltrans getting together to make State Route 225 part of the city of Santa Barbara where it belongs. I'm going to speak quickly just about, I'm also a member of the Mesa Architects, and we've studied, we've walked, we've biked, we've done everything, and are pretty familiar with Cliff Drive. And really, to Councilmember Francisco's comments from the last meeting, we agree that the need for simple, inexpensive crosswalks so the pedestrian system can start to regenerate itself on the mesa is very important. Our research and in fact, we had a big map at Springfest a couple of years ago and asked people to put dots on the intersections that they felt needed crosswalks. And really, we need 2 crosswalks additional to what exists now on the east side and some minor improvements, but really a crosswalk at either Santa Cruz or probably Santa Cruz because it's a T intersection that would help Shifco and help the church, and it's a good distance and school kids could jog over a block or so, and one at potentially at San Miguel, given the sight lines and so forth. The new configuration of the road allows for, we have parking and then a bike lane, and then you only have to cross 12 feet of traffic, and then if there's no second turn lane, a low profile median can be put there, curb height with a flush walk-through that gives pedestrians the ability to cross 12 feet of traffic going this way, have a 10-foot buffer, wide buffer for waiting for traffic to go the other way. It's a very inexpensive, about $10,000 of installation for just some curbs and a little bit of asphalt. It's not going to be beautiful, but it's going to be safe, and it's a step toward safety, and then, as we've always said, making the Mesa Cliff Drive more beautiful when funds allow. So please give that some thought. If I have 2 seconds, I will say that there is potentially light pedestrian relative to other parts of town movement on Cliff Drive, and it's because it's so bloody dangerous. More people, the traffic is caused because everybody drives their kids to school because it's not safe to walk to school. So you build it and the pedestrians will come. Thank you.
Thank you. Nick Sebastian.
Good afternoon. I'm Nick Sebastian. I own a home on Las Positas Place, and all of the comments before me were right on point. I came, as I did in the last meeting, to address the Las Positas Road portion. The council should vote unanimously for option number 2, move forward with relinquishment in parallel with preparation of the road work, of the work plan, excuse me. It is inconceivable that any council member would be in support of Measure Y and still not vote in favor of relinquishment today. State records indicate a high rate of injury accidents, and yet we would add additional cars, no stop signs or stoplights, and no reduction in the speed limit on Las Positas Road, and attempt to call Measure Y project a safe route to the beach. That is laughable. Considering only 2 adults per household, 25 homes will lead to a minimum of 50 cars on Las Positas, and it will probably be more than that with young adults. Relinquishment and Measure Y are not mutually exclusive issues. Relinquishment, speed reduction, and other safety improvements must be implemented before approving any additional exit entry roads or bridges onto Las Positas Road. We all know that there will be a Hillside House proposal in the future, and now is the time for plan for any additional development. No one can guarantee that the same relinquishment offer will be on the table from Caltrans in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Hillary Blackerby?
Hi, Madam Mayor and Council members. I'm Hillary Blackerby from Assemblymember Doss Williams' office. Glad to be here today and hopefully maybe on the cusp of making a change and moving forward. I got to say, it kind of seems like the goalposts have been moving on this one. For as long as it's been, the negotiations have been ongoing for a long time. Seemed like there were three sticking points. There was the bridge over the railroad tracks. There was the drainage improvements and how much those were going to cost. And then there was a liability issue. Caltrans said, we'll keep the bridge, we'll give you what you want for drainage, and let's be honest about the liability thing. Even the mayor said, that's kind of silly. We would never maintain liability for something that we gave to a different jurisdiction. Now that those have been cleared up, it seems like now we have all these statistics that maybe it's not safe, maybe there's more accidents. I just want to be clear, and now that there's a work plan that's $30,000 more proposed, I want us to make sure that we're clear about that it's about relinquishment, first and foremost. That's what this was supposed to be about all along. And then coming up with a plan and a vision for the Mesa, which it certainly needs, many parts of our city need, that we can move forward with that at a different point or in parallel. But to just make sure that we focus on what this whole long process has really been about, which is making it a city street, working in good faith with Caltrans. It seems like the next steps, if you do move forward with relinquishment, a lot of the work is on Caltrans to do with those reports. It was a different slide. But we would just encourage you to move forward. We think it's the right thing to do, and as the mayor said last time, if not now, when? Thanks.
Thank you. That closes public comment, and it's to the council. Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I had a question perhaps for Mr. Bailey, if I could. Some of the speakers have mentioned, crosswalks and whatnot along Cliff Drive, especially at certain intersections where school kids cross, or there's churches or senior centers or whatever. Assuming there was a relinquishment and the street was ours, what types of processes and or warrants would we need to justify crosswalks, and would they be the kind of, and this is all hypothetical, but would they be the kind of things we've talked about for Milpas? Would it be something different? Would it be a stoplight? Just anecdotally, what do you think we'd be looking at in terms of moving forward with something as simple as the paint on the ground idea?
Thank you, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rose. As we discussed on Milpas, the wider the street, the higher the traffic volumes, the less appropriate paint on the ground is in terms of facilitating safe pedestrian crossings. And one difference we have here between Cliff Drive and Milpas is speed. As Ms. Anderson said earlier, the 85th percentile speed on Cliff Drive is nearly 45 miles an hour, whereas on Milpas, we were looking at speeds in the low 30s. So we've got similar width, similar traffic volumes, but substantially higher speeds. Because of that, the complexity of providing pedestrian crossings is much greater than what we were even looking at on Milpas. So our options are even more limited. So as far as the process we would go through, I think we generally know now there aren't a lot of pedestrians on Cliff Drive, and as the speakers have said, it's because people find crossing Cliff Drive to be a barrier. So it would be identifying locations where people want to cross, and then identifying the types of improvements that would be appropriate for that type of environment. And they are going to be more complex than just paint on the ground in order to make it safe.
So would something like a bus stop location be factored into that type of decision?
Absolutely. Pedestrian generators, where people want to cross, where people have to cross, it would all factor in.
Thank you.
Mr. White?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This work program that's before us, the what if I would have is, how would this rank into staff's recommendations for 2012, 2013 activities if this were a city street?
Good question. Madam Mayor, Councilmember White, I didn't see that twist coming at the end. I think that if what I was expecting you to ask would be if this was to become a state, instead of a state, a city facility. And clearly, I think that is our expectation as staff as we've gone through these discussions on relinquishment, that we would see Cliff Drive, in particular along the Cliff Drive and Las Positas route, as becoming a much higher priority for not only the traffic operational investment, but also the maintenance end of things. So even though, as was pointed out by one of the speakers, it's considered maybe 3% of the total mileage, it's a 4 to 5 lane facility at different points, principal arterial. Those rank much higher in the demand for resources. And so, yes, if this were currently a city facility, it would be a priority focus for resources from the analysis of traffic impacts to maintenance.
Mr. House?
Good point, actually. I think it's a good reason why a lot of people are here and very interested. They want to see it a higher priority. I mean, it needs to be. I will just comment. With the concentration of the schools and other community center type locations, and we're talking about the entire stretch. I think we can say safely that the service La Cumbre Junior High, the ballet school up there, Ealings Park, the Monroe and McKinley, and I mean all these churches, City College, and of course you've got the Commerce Center right there, and the fire station and Shifco. There's a lot of real community stuff going on with this broad river flowing through it, and it seems to me this is the kind of a candidate for Safe Routes to Schools kinds of grants, not just for the main line, if you will, of Cliff, but also for the neighboring streets and to really get it functioning. I know that we've been over there at different times when, like Bike to School Day, and you listen to the parents who, that one day they do that, and they've begun, at least at Washington School, to really utilize parents and volunteers to get the kids to school safely, but in an active way. But it still is really a difficult thing altogether. And wouldn't we just, like, as soon as we possibly could and became a city road, that we would begin to look for opportunities for grant funding to really address those kinds of issues and begin to accumulate those funds for projects that could really make a difference?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember House, that would be my expectation, and in a way, that's the recommendation. Number 2 is that there would be some, assuming relinquishment were to move forward at this point, that there would be some understanding of how staff would be preparing for when that transition were to occur, so that we would be in a better position to have a stronger handle than the current rough estimate of the CIP at this point in terms of what types of projects, what kind of eligibility for different grant proposals, what kind of packaging would need to be part of going forward with improvement in the pedestrian safety primarily, as well as the mobility issues of the accident statistics for this facility. So I think that was the long answer to the short.
That helps.
Yes.
So we would, yes, right? I mean, and then and also the traffic impacts right now. I mean, at each of the schools, the parents, except for the kids that live really right near a school, just a few blocks away on the same side of the street, but the kids come from pretty far to go to these schools, and And that's one of the things I was surprised to find out. I don't know if everybody's aware, but to get the kids that go to Washington School come from a really broad area there, and some of them by choice too, because it's such a great school. But the neighborhoods themselves would be benefited by any of these improvements. Also, if we could begin to reduce traffic during those times. So just to shift over a little bit to comments here, I want to say that I did definitely feel the goalposts moving, but of course that's part of our conversation. We've checked it down to an issue. I know Mr. Wiley continues to have issues of liability. I understand why, Tiger that he is, he'd be fighting for everything he could get for the city to make sure that we continue to get the best deal we possibly can. But truthfully, we're going to take this over, and it's going to be our responsibility. And the reason why there might be liability in the first place is we haven't really had the chance to get our hands on it. And over time, over maybe decades, it'll get better and better. And I just want to say that the community has generated a vision for that area. I do not know what it would have cost for the city of Santa Barbara to host that kind of a vision for a neighborhood. But I can bet with the professional costs of retaining a facilitator, as we've done before in other parts of our community, the waterfront study, all over town we've done. All this has been done pro bono. And we're being handed a community who is very strongly supportive of this relinquishment. And they're very sober about it. They're recognizing that the relinquishment is the first step, but they don't have high expectations that suddenly it's all going to transform overnight. It's going to take a long time. And then I just think that there's an opportunity that will open up some of these costs that we're talking about. Yes, there are going to be ongoing costs associated with it, but we've really gotten a free ride for a long time. I mean, this is the time for us to really step up and take responsibility for this. And I recognize it will cost more, but it's because it's serving our constituents who live in that area. So as I went from questions to comments, but I really think it's important that you get to hear my strong feeling about this. There are a few pedestrians on Cliff Drive, but I used to live up there. I've had 3 times I've been there, and I used it all the time. With a big missing are the missing links of the sidewalk along Cliff Drive. Forget the crossing. I mean, went back and forth to City College and down to my store, and I use Cliff Drive all the time. And there are many times there, and I use it for running too. And it's just you're out in the street, and it becomes a dirt path for some reason. If the city had that over time, we would make sure that the property owners along the side there, and we would participate. It would get better. So I think this is one of these that we just kind of suck it up and we go, because the city and the community is totally supportive, and it will make a benefit to our constituents in that area.
Mr. Francisco?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. First, a question, Ms. Anderson. The way you described the potential work plan with the 4 pieces, this is just my point of view. I think that really the question here, and the question that I think should have been asked a long time ago, is since the main reason for acquiring this state highway is to make pedestrian safety improvements, if that wasn't an issue, there would be no reason for this at all. And I think all of us up here agree, and all of us in the room agree, that that is an absolutely vital priority. So from my point of view, really the only issue of concern here is how much are those pedestrian safety improvements going to cost? And this sort of builds off what Councilmember Rouse just asked. Painting a crosswalk is not going to be a viable solution. It's going to be something more capital intensive than that. What exactly it is, we don't know. But my main question about acquiring this highway would be answered with the answer to that question. What is the cost on that? Because I do agree with Councilmember House that one way or the other, we are going to acquire this highway sooner or later, and we will have to accept whatever liability comes with that. And I'm not a lawyer, but I do assume that at least some of the risk that comes along with that is built into the fact that the state built it the way they built it. We did not build it. And of course, we would do everything we could to improve that situation once we eventually acquire it. But my question to you is, would it be possible to structure this work in such a way that we got the question about the actual cost of pedestrian safety improvements rather quicker? And I say that because I think the other questions are really secondary.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Francisco, we could, I think there are elements of what is included in the capital improvement program element for this corridor that are derived from assumptions of what it would take to make improvements that would support constructed pedestrian facilities. So we could break that down a bit more in terms of the cost assumptions that went into that, and that would. But I think the reality of what we're talking about is it's not the hundreds of thousands. We're talking about more reasonably something that's approaching the millions to be able to actually achieve the goals that we've got identified for this corridor. What we can do as an interim that would be safe, and it's kind of the don't make it worse kind of consideration. There are things you can do that actually increase the lack of safety by creating a false sense of security or a false sense of safety. So those are the things that I think are the most challenging for us in looking at what incrementally we could do and what cost would be associated with that, so that we didn't create and draw people to a situation that was not adequately protected for the type of use they would be looking at. And we have a very challenging corridor here, as everyone has spoken to it. There are so many access points. There are so many cross streets that don't align with each other, so that you've got offset intersections, you've got residential, you've got commercial, you've got these magnets of trip generation, particularly for pedestrians relative to schools and churches, and it's the perfect storm of all of the different types of considerations that you would be trying to address. So it makes it a more complex solution as well. But it's not going to be an inexpensive one. It's not a paint on the ground kind of a solution that is actually going to increase the safety. And we don't want to be misleading along those lines. But I think being able to come up with some strategies that could be combinations of projects, trying to be as cost effective as possible, would be the logical approach that the city would be wanting to take if we move forward on the relinquishment.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
So,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
are we considering ourselves to be in question-only mode at the moment? So, to get to my question, though, would it be possible to prioritize the part about the safety improvements and get that sooner than 6 months? Or was that really the limiting factor to begin with?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Francisco, for me, the dilemma right now is being able to give you good, solid information versus we can give you a best guess. We can give you the best guess rather quickly. To give you a solid answer takes time.
Okay.
And the in-between doesn't get you much better than the best guess.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about the best guess later.
Okay.
So, again, as I think as we've talked about before, everyone here agrees that this should be a city street. It started out as a state highway when there weren't a whole lot of people living up there. Now there are a lot of people living there. It has become, over time, a very heavily populated, very dense residential area with a lot of other uses, as Ms. Anderson has just pointed out. And clearly what it should be is not a state highway, but a residential arterial. That's what it should be. And my concern all along has been, what is it going to cost us to transform a state highway into a residential arterial? Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't do it, but we should know how much it's going to cost and when we're going to be able to do it. With respect to the question about goalposts moving, again, my only concern here, and I think it's a question that really should have been asked a lot earlier, is what is it actually going to involve in order to create pedestrian safety on Cliff Drive? That's what we need to know. What is it going to involve? What kind of changes have to happen to that road to actually make it possible to make it safe for pedestrians? And then how much is that going to cost? And then put that into the capital improvement plan. To me, that is the prudent approach, and it's the approach that I think should have been followed from the beginning here. But of course, on the other hand, another way to look at this is when this process started, the city was in better financial shape, the nation's economy was in better financial shape, and we had a redevelopment agency. One of the things that has changed now is that we have lost tens of millions of dollars that were going to go to capital improvement projects with the untimely dissolution of the RDA. And as Mr. Armstrong and Mr. Casey have found in their thrilling experiences with the Oversight Board, we may have still less money than we thought going into this. So for me, thinking about the actual cost of capital improvements is really, really important, and has become far more important just in the past year. I think if we're going to go forward with this, we want to know how much it costs, because if it turns out that in order to get the pedestrian improvements that we all want on Cliff Drive, if it turns out that's going to cost $10 million, I can tell you that's not going to happen anytime soon, no matter how much we all want it. And if that's true, then it doesn't make sense to take over the maintenance of that roadway if all we're doing is getting the deed, and we're not able to actually make any useful changes. And that's the whole point of this. Simply saying that, well, we'll acquire it and then we'll figure out what we're going to do later, to me, makes no sense. What we need to do is figure out what do we actually have to create on that roadway to make it safe for people to cross it. And when we know what that is and we know how much it costs, then we go into this with our eyes open instead of just moving forward and saying, well, we'll figure it out and we hope it works. And I feel that that's one of my chief responsibilities as a city council member, to make sure that whatever projects the city takes on, it knows that it can actually pay for them. And again, we know that the projects that are involved here, that are going to be involved in making this into a residential arterial from what it is, are all going to be very expensive. Mr. House here just spoke about sidewalks, and we all know how much sidewalks cost from recent experience. There's also, I think we need to be clear about this. There have not been significant pedestrian improvements on Cliff Drive because it's a state highway, and that's not because Caltrans is full of people with ill intent who don't want pedestrians to be safe. It's just that, as Ms. Anderson was pointing out, it's a very, very tough problem to take a road that was originally a highway and make it safe for pedestrians to get across. We will face that same problem when we acquire the highway. Nothing is going to change overnight. So what I would say is the best way forward here is to move forward with this study. We've already made a lot of progress with Caltrans. I think both sides in this negotiation at this point know what all the issues are. We've agreed on what the costs would be. But from my pragmatic point of view, if we're not going to be able to make any changes to Cliff Drive for 5 years, why take it over now? So what I would say the best way forward is to move forward with this study plan as expeditiously as possible. I personally believe that the most high priority thing is finding out the actual costs of making safe pedestrian crossings. I think every other issue involved with this is something that we're just going to have to deal with one way or the other. I, of course, want those other answers as well, but that is the only one that's absolutely crucial in my mind to the question of taking over that highway. So that's what I would suggest. Go forward with the study plan, get those answers, and then make the decision about when to acquire.
You're looking at option 3?
I am.
Okay. Mr. Hotchkiss?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Let me read something from the last report for the May 1st meeting. It said no additional street fund revenues are projected, so SR 255 would result in reduced street maintenance in other areas of the city. That's still true, I assume.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, yes, that is.
Then it goes on to say, based on past public comment, there's an expectation that the city will provide other public improvements soon after relinquishment. The cost of these additional improvements is difficult to estimate, but an estimate of $11.5 million is reflected in the city's 6-year CIP category of unfunded projects. So actually, when you said 10 million, it might have been conservative. It could be as high as. All right. So I think what Mr. Francisco is saying is that you don't want to buy a sandwich without knowing what's between the bread, and there's a lot of money there, and at the cost of $367,000 a year just to take it in our hands, right? The one thing we haven't spoken of directly, and I'd now like to address, has been Mr. Wiley's comments on this that I think are still very important. Could you talk again, just to remind us about the liability problems?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, yes, as I mentioned at the May 1st hearing or meeting, the logic of suggesting that Caltrans either agree to indemnify the city for a period of time or to fund a reserve for liability is really no different than the concern that Public Works raised and which has been appropriately addressed by Caltrans for possible expenses related to the railroad bridge or the hillside. It's an unfunded liability, potential unfunded liability. In the case of Public Works, it's very specific about certain things. Well, but when people say there's no logic to, why would Caltrans agree to accept some liability after transferring title? They're doing that very thing with respect to the railroad bridge and respect to the drainage improvements in the hillside. So my suggestion is not very different from things that Caltrans has already agreed to. We've talked about the concept of design immunity and the Government Tort Claims Act, and design immunity works well when an area of a street or an intersection or an improvement has essentially not proven itself to be unsafe. But accidents can basically invalidate design immunity, despite the best engineers in the world having designed something. If the reality proves different, then there will be no design immunity. So just to maybe perhaps make that more concrete or give an example, I believe I recall just a few months ago a fatality in Las Positas early in the morning involving someone who apparently fell asleep and drove off the road and hit I believe a palm tree. There are, and Mr. Bailey would certainly know a whole lot more about this than I do. I know what I know based on reading court decisions. There are safety standards, state and federal safety standards for barriers along highways, for guardrails. And they essentially say when a guardrail is required as a matter of design and when it's not. This is particularly true for freeways, but state highways as well, for certain roads with certain speed limits. And it has to do with whether there's a grade separation at the shoulder, things like that. Detailed empirical studies when guardrails are required. So, for example, I believe it would be probably true to say that there are not guardrails on certain portions of Las Positas because that's as designed, and those designs are consistent with safety standards. But as accidents show that maybe a guardrail is needed, and now we've got one apparent accident that may indicate that, a judge and a jury, a judge in this initially is going to be much less inclined to say, I will follow the design immunity and dismiss this lawsuit against the city. And typically this comes up on a motion for summary judgment where the city says, Your Honor, we can prove through our records that there have been no prior similar accidents at this location, and then we can prove that this stretch of highway or this intersection was designed and built by engineers in accordance with its safety design. We've had serious accidents, serious lawsuits where the city's been dismissed because we're able to prove that. And design immunity acts as a presumption that essentially the law is saying the public, the city, is not an absolute insurer of traffic safety. And you can't just sue the city every time there's a serious accident and say, well, that intersection had something to do, the city is liable and owes. However, the second time you get an accident like that, a similar, let's say this kind of accident, a fatality, someone driving off of Las Positas, I can tell you, as a practical matter, most judges are not going to grant summary judgment. They're going to say there's an issue here that needs to be decided by the jury, and that issue is, has this design proven itself in the accident history to be unsafe? And any time in negligence and in tort liability that you're looking at a jury trial, and in almost invariably these lawsuits involve some pretty sympathetic plaintiffs, some family members or someone who's severely injured, it's tough to go in front of a jury and to explain to a jury how a deep pocket defendant like a public entity shouldn't share in the cost of that. Even though legally that's true, juries tend to see it otherwise.
And if it was still a state road, you wouldn't be in the courtroom, correct?
No, we've never been sued over SR 225 because it's not our highway. And just to finish, what I'm suggesting then, again, is not different than what Public Works has suggested, that Caltrans agree to indemnify the city, either to indemnify the city for a period of years while we transition to a highway that has clearly become a city highway with our improvements and our maintenance and our management of that highway, say for a 10-year period, or that they fund a reserve for 10 years, which would only be used to reimburse the city in the event the city is successfully sued or forced to settle for liability involving a Caltrans-designed intersection or section. And finally, it occurred to me that although there may be some reasons why this isn't, Caltrans has agreed to relinquish only portions of highways. And I know their position is that the whole SR 225 should be relinquished. And I know in our research of the accident history, a lot of the serious accidents has to do with the Las Positas stretch of 225. And I know the public comments are focusing more on the Cliff Drive stretch. So possibly there's a way to only relinquish or only take title to a portion of the 225.
But still with the liability limitations that you spoke of.
Yes, and I'm, it's like half a loaf in suggesting that. I do believe there have been a history of serious accidents at certain portions of Cliff Drive, particularly at the stretch near City College.
Right. One thing that occurred to me, I think it was Mr. House was suggesting that if it became a city street, that there would somehow be improvements in sidewalks, and then that would lead to a reduction in traffic. But unfortunately, or fortunately, nothing seems to lead to a reduction in traffic these days. So I doubt that that's really an element of, and that would have much effect. And so I think my responsibility is greater than, although it's painful to say to everybody here, greater than just those of us in this room, but that it extends to people throughout the city, and that includes their streets as well as yours, and their money also, and yours. And it's wiser to know really what we're buying before we buy it, rather than just get excited, which I know everybody is right now, and jump in. Thank you. So to put it in numbers, I am a three-man also.
The clarification, Mr. Wiley, about the bridge, when you said it's the same thing, Caltrans has offered to keep ownership of the bridge, so it would make sense the liability, if there is any, would stay with Caltrans because they own the bridge. The difference with 225 relinquishment is that they would no longer own the street. So I don't see those two things as the same.
Well, Madam Mayor, respectfully, ownership is just a legal conclusion on a piece of paper. To say that they don't own it when they're responsible for maintaining it if it falls down, the ownership is beside the point. It's like I say.
Well, it decides who's responsible for the maintenance, right?
People have said, well, who would sell a home and retain liability for fixing a home? I don't see that as any different. The ownership is really beside the point. The fact is that Caltrans is agreeing to maintain and to repair that bridge, apparently in perpetuity, and that's no different than what I'm suggesting in terms of liability.
Well, but that piece of concrete, that area it won't be relinquished to the city. It'll still be part of Caltrans's facilities. I guess that's the word we're using. It'll still be a Caltrans facility and not a city facility. I mean, there's a big difference. I mean, there's got to be a big difference in our mind. What's the whole conversation if it doesn't matter who owns it and then who maintains it, right? I mean, that's part of the whole local control conversation we're having. I mean, I don't want to argue back and forth, but I'm just trying to, I just see those two things as different from how I heard you say it. So because of who's responsible for the maintenance and then therefore if anything should go wrong for clearing that up based on ownership. And that's what Caltrans has offered, is to retain ownership of the bridge, and therefore, okay, just to clear that, really clear now. Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, I know that in my business, I live in a world of public liability, so I understand a lot of that stuff, and of course, we're liable for things that happened at the airport and the waterfront and all sorts of areas, as it is anyway. And eventually, like I said, it probably likely will be ours. I wanted to bring up the point with Mr. Bailey about the crosswalks and what we're doing to make sure we're got kind of a sober, eyes open look at all this, because it isn't just going to be paint on the ground. It's not going to be just, going to Frazie's and getting a gallon of paint and making the crosswalk happen. It's going to be more complex than that. But that being said, I'm going to steal Mr. Kelly's line about the Main Street on the Mesa, and what it is to have this non-jurisdictional control right through an arterial through a major neighborhood. We had an issue the other night that's not related, but it had to do with having outside jurisdiction within a residential neighborhood. And it really hit home to me as I thought about that and thought about the lack of control we had over this particular issue. And as people looked to us as city leaders, and all we could say was, it's not my job. It's not what I do. It's not part of from the restaurant, it's not my section. Well, nobody wants to hear that. The point of the matter is that this arterial goes through an area that we tax people in. We restrict what you do with your homes. We restrict what you do with your businesses. And yet when it comes to the main artery, we say, that's not ours. So that's a little counterintuitive for me. To me, that is a part of our neighborhood. That is part of what we do. We voted to improve that, or Caltrans to improve that, to make our neighborhood more of a neighborhood and not so much of some place that bounded a state highway. So I agree with my colleagues. I'm kind of looking at a 2.5, not a 2 or 3, but I want to respect certainly Mr. Wiley's concerns about the liability and Ms. Anderson's concerns about the expense and whatnot going forward. But I do believe that I do not want to be in a position, for example, the thing we're going through with Milpas right now. I wouldn't want to look at those people and said, I'm sorry, this is a state highway. We can't do anything about that. Hope to God we'll never see that situation again. But I wouldn't want to be there on Cliff Drive. I wouldn't want to be there in Las Positas. We've got some issues come up with Measure Y. Another gentleman brought up the Measure Y issue along with whether or not we, could we, if we didn't take relinquishment, but we went through with Measure Y. And I have to agree. I mean, there's got to be some kind of, we don't have to say, well, let me call Sacramento and see what we can do about that. I think we need to have local control of this street. I think we need to facilitate that. I think we need to move forward with this work plan as expeditiously as possible. I know that Caltrans is looking for some kind of a firm commitment on what we're going to do, and kind of have to agree because we really have gone to the mats with them, and our staff did an amazing job of getting pretty much our wish list covered with Caltrans. So to me, in the world of deal making, I think it would be almost a little disingenuous not to move forward, because I really think that is our desire. I want to move cautiously. I want to do it with our eyes open. But I don't think it's time to make the work plan happen, to see what's going on and go, just kidding, we weren't really going to do that after all. So I don't know if we're done with comments yet or not, or if it's time for a motion. But
I haven't commented yet, Mr. White nor Ms. Murillo, but that's
then I'll step to that.
I'm going to actually, if I could take a little prerogative and follow up on that, because it was along my line of thinking was similar in the sense that we need to make a decision. Punting this down the road no pun intended, or maybe pun intended. I don't think that helps anybody. It doesn't help us on the council. It doesn't help the community. It doesn't help Caltrans. Doesn't help staff. It's just going in circles. So, frankly, I think we need to make a decision. Are we going to move forward with relinquishment or not? And I think Mr. Francisco brings up some excellent points of wanting to know how much things cost and get some more information. And I don't see why we can't still do that with item 2. It's going to be 14 to 18 months, and as during that time, the work plan will take less time than that before the relinquishment. We could say it cost $100 million. Who knows? 50 million, 10 million, whatever. But we don't know what options are there for funding. How can we work with the community if we need a new source of revenue somehow? There must be ways that we can work together and collaborate to figure that out. It's not a yes/no status quo situation here. And I think to wait to find out for some maybe magic number from staff, time will move on, cost will change, and we'll be back where we started from when the road becomes a city street 14 and 18 months later, or if we even delay that even further. So all that information, yes, absolutely, we need the information. How much would things cost? What kind of things are we talking about? But I don't see why. I think by saying we need everything possible in front of us to make a decision to relinquish is just going to be a lot of busy work, because by the time relinquishment happens, that information that we had today is going to become stale, and it's going to need updating. And so it doesn't seem to make any sense to me, when in fact we need to make a decision of moving forward or not. And I know that's pushing the issue. And I know there's some concern about it, but I think we owe it to ourselves, the city, Caltrans, and especially to the community to give them an answer after all these years. So, I do think, if it takes, I think the comment was something like, if it's going to take 5 years to even start to do something, why start now? It's because it's going to take that long time to even get to the city streets in order to get to the grants, in order to get to the thing. By the time, even we go through the regular process, it'll be 5 years later anyway. And if we don't do it now, it's going to be 10 years or 15 years. That's been the conversation we've had now for almost 20 years. It's the same conversation. And so we either need to, I think we need to decide, are we done with this conversation and just move on, or do we move forward with relinquishment? And I think it's obvious I've been one to advocate for relinquishment. So I thought I'd put that out because I think it addresses, well, at least what Mr. Rouse was saying in trying to be in a 2.5, but I really think it's more of a 2. I think you can get the answers you want and need, and what we all need, with option 2. Ms. Murillo.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Can I ask Ms. Anderson for you to clarify, or Mr. White, Councilmember White, asked something and everybody went, ooh, good question, but I wasn't sure what the question was or the answer. It had to do with priorities. Was that priorities within your department or priorities for funding? Was that too long ago? Do you remember?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Murillo, I remember. The question really related to, and my answer was related to the fact that this facility is a principal arterial. And the designation of principal arterial elevates the importance in the transportation system. So it's not to say that other streets and roadways are not important. It means that it carries a lot of traffic. It has a lot of different activities going on relative to the transportation system. And so those are the types of facilities that tend to get priority because they affect so many people. So the differential would be a residential street that has limited need for general public's use and is primarily there for direct access to adjacent properties. That's going to be a lower priority for our resources compared to a principal arterial that responds to commercial and residential and multiple needs. So that was the reason for my answer of...
What did you mean by resources? I think that's what I'm...
And the resource question is both on the maintenance side. If we have condition issues, the priority for addressing condition issues on the roadways that have the highest demand for use and variety of use is higher than, as I said, when we're prioritizing our limited resource, the requirements for those higher use facilities will be higher. So when we have a transportation operations question, once again, we are always prioritizing our work, and we do have a commitment to getting to all of the needs across the city, but when we have a trade-off of needs, and one is in the more principal arterial type of classification, those do tend to get and rank higher in our prioritization of resource.
And Milpas Street and Salinas are both arterials as well?
Those would be arterials, probably more minor arterials rather than the principal, in this case, sections of them, because they change, as you know, going up the street. But the areas that link to 101, they are pulled into that higher level of use and different types of trips and traffic, and so yes.
Okay. And as to the liability question, when Caltrans came up last time, the number paid out was $35,000, right, over the whole time period. So that speaks volumes to me that, yes, we'll take on some liability, but I think that question is not moving me so much today as others. You know, I came here a couple of weeks ago, and to me, taking on $365,000 a year seemed pretty clear cut, and I thought, oh, that's going to move us. We're going to reject this, and we didn't. It wasn't an easy no vote question, and when we left May 1st, I guess it was, the mayor asked, if not now, when? And I really took that to heart, and I started to think about that $365,000 a year, and frankly, I don't think any of the speakers today have really addressed that, because that is a big number. But when will we have that money in our streets fund? Well, never, right? And so I don't think never is a good answer to relinquishment. And, you know, I was a no relinquishment person 2 weeks ago until I started thinking about that and went back, didn't totally erase my memory, but really gave it a lot of thought. And today, after talking to a lot of people, and frankly, some people weren't very helpful. You know, I'd say, what do you think about the State Route 225 issue? And they'd say, Kathy, I'm glad I'm not in your shoes. I'm like, thank you. Thanks. Thanks for no information. Yeah, it is a big decision. And I've had a headache about it, frankly, you know, for a couple of days now. But I go around in circles and I come back to the middle, and I go around in circles and come back to the middle. And what has pushed me over into 51, because believe me, it's not much more than that, is the public safety issue. Having been a pedestrian, I wish I rode a bike more often, but I have dashed across Cliff Drive when I lived up there briefly, but was evicted for snoring. Thank you. And I was younger then, and I could actually run across the street. So I think about the kids, and I think about the seniors living there at Schiffco, and we know it's going to cost millions. And, right, I think we knew that a year ago. I think we knew that 2 years ago. We know that it's going to take narrowing the street, putting in the medians. We've been through this with Milpas, right? You can't just, I wish we could just paint the street. That kind of sounds simple and cheap. Lay some zebra stripes there. That's not going to do it. We'll just be asking for trouble. But again, we can't wait until everything is perfect. And I'm very, very, very uncomfortable taking on the annual cost of maintenance. But if I just weigh everything, I have to come down on the side of public safety. And I don't want to lose sight of the needs of other parts of the city. But overall, I think it's good government for the city to control this thoroughfare and start the process of making it safer. And I do want to say to the Mesa residents, what if we look at a couple of intersections? Mr. Van Hoyt came up and he was suggesting Santa Cruz and San Miguel, and maybe it's just going to be one big crosswalk somewhere, maybe at Shivco, a start, right? But I trust our people to figure that out. And let me just see if my notes, if I've missed anything, because this is just a huge decision. And like I say, I went round and round on it. And today I would more support option 2. So if I think Mr. Hotchkiss sort of seconded the motion.
There wasn't a motion yet.
Oh, okay. Well, can I move then? Number 2, move forward with relinquishment in parallel with preparation of the work plan.
There's a second? Okay. Mr. White?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, I do think this is one of those decisions that where there's no easy answer on this one. It's an uncomfortable choice of, first of all, watching and participating in the degradation of our street system year in and year out is an enraging experience. We managed to get the streets back up near to the standard that is acceptable to this city with a big influx of federal money last couple years ago. And here we are looking at an opportunity to take on more liability, and we're hearing a big liability in terms of priority. This comes just steps out ahead of our neighborhood streets and gets priority on funding. And yes, it's in decent shape. We saw the restriping occur, which was a great evidence of collaboration with Caltrans, which might not have happened 10 years ago, certainly not 20. And so coming back to, and also hearing from Caltrans, hearing that decision needs to be made. I've probably changed my mind on this more times than almost any other decision that I've made, I've been asked to participate in on council. And I do come down on the side of relinquishment. So I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to go with the relinquishment and put it back on staff and say, come back to us when with the budget material and decide when we should spend the money to do the analysis. Save the $35,000 or whatever it is. I mean, that's just put it in the mix, and if that comes up to the top of the pile, okay, fine. I'm hearing at least a motion to go with spending that more money going to come out of somewhere else. What city street won't get something because we're taking $35,000 out of that pot? And this is not unique to this city. It's a state issue. It's a regional issue, state and federal. And I think that's where some of the cures are going to come from, is when are we going to actually invest? When are we going to, first of all, raise the money to make the investments? And I see that only in the form of a fuel tax, something to that effect. And that's what I hope is coming in a 5-year time frame. I expect it's not, but that's what's needed. So I'm willing to go forward with the relinquishment reluctantly. It's counter to the bean counter in me, and but I do appreciate that I'm coming in the middle of a long-term project too, and that's something that I'm mindful of where this is something that people have been working on a long time. So reluctantly, I'll support relinquishment.
Mr. House?
It's nice to feel the support of council, and I know it's hard. This is a difficult decision, but it's not an impromptu kind of thing. This is something that's been in the vision works, if you will, for a long, long time, and it is a long-term policy goal of the city to move in this direction. And I'm glad that we're wrestling with it. I'm glad we're wrestling with it in a difficult time rather than a flush time, because we're really making it. It's a sober decision. It's one that requires us to be mindful of the trade-offs and the costs. One of the things that I am aware of, and I know Mr. Francisco, I think you as well, but I just want to say it out loud. When something gets on our 6-year capital plan, our 6-year CIP, we have general ideas for the 5th and 6th year where the money might come from for some of those projects. We have some sense of it. We don't always know for sure. In fact, that's why it stays out there and doesn't get on the 2-year plan. And when it does, then we know pretty much where funding is going to come from. And so we have a lot of future embedded in our CIP that hasn't yet been fully we don't know quite where it's all going to come from. And then because we have it as a priority, because it is on that plan list, there are opportunities that show up sometimes quite unexpectedly. I don't expect another ARA funding thing to come through, but we were ready, and we had projects ready to go when that happened. If there were to be some resolve and some will at the state level, and they were to be able to get the appropriate tax on gasoline and begin to distribute it appropriately, we could be ready for that. And some of this is that kind of long-range planning. I look around and I see where we've been able to do that, and I'm very proud of the city and of our staff, by the way, for being able to seize the moment on everything from our bridges to lighting to the use of funds that otherwise would have stayed on State Street into our neighborhoods and really make the neighborhoods beautiful. So a little point here. This business about it becoming a higher priority, I just want to really go back to this. That is exactly why I feel this is the right thing to do. We are a policy board after all, and we're shining a light on this. Not an exclusion to Milpas and Salinas and that area. It's not exclusive. We're going to have to find a way to balance this. But this area needs our attention, and it deserves it. The community has stepped up. This is momentum. We didn't know how the power lines were going to come down, and then because we had the resolve and the creativity and the innovation, we were able to marshal those funds and look at it today. This is a step in that direction with regards to this street. So self-determination and a sense of our vision for the area, that's what I'm supporting. And Mr. White, I have to say, I tend to agree with you a little bit. I know that there's an interest here on the council to have a little bit more of a defined plan for the area. I can understand that. For me, it's not necessary, because for me, I feel like this is the step forward in showing the priority and the vision, and those things will follow as we move past this budget and move into the next year. But I do support the motion, and I'm really glad to hear the council moving in this direction.
Mr. Francisco.
Thank you. As I think was clear the last time around when we discussed this, we all believe that this should be a local street. And the only question here is, when should that occur? Typically, when we take on projects of this magnitude, we have some idea of how we're going to pay for them. And so, for instance, Mr. House, when we went in, decided to do the utility undergrounding on Cliff Drive, we did that because we have a utility undergrounding fund, partly funded by Edison. And so that was the next project online to use those funds. So we knew exactly how much money we had and where it was coming from. This is a case where we don't have much money, and we don't know where it's coming from. We don't even know what it's going to cost. And that's why I would say that, and this is building off of Mr. Rouse's comment, of course, we want local control. But local control and a deed are not the same thing. If we want public safety on Cliff Drive, and we all want public safety, we're going to have to make massive changes to that street. So if we go forward with the relinquishment, and it looks like that's what we're doing, we'll have that deed, let's say, by the end of 2013. If we can't make the improvements that are necessary to create pedestrian safety on Cliff Drive until 2019, we'll be paying $367,000 a year in maintenance costs, and we will have no more effective control over Cliff Drive than we do today. So obviously, that's the direction we've decided on, and I hope it all works out. I obviously also believe that we need to continue to go forward with a study on how much the pedestrian improvements are going to cost, because I think it's absolutely vital for us to know what it is we're going to have to do in order to actually make the safety improvements that everyone wants. And the sooner we know what that dollar value is, then we can go out and start figuring out how we're going to find that money in an environment where we've lost literally tens of millions of dollars to the state in money that was already earmarked for vital infrastructure projects. So anyway, I think that we really need to go forward with the study project. I don't think we can drop that. Thanks.
Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, I do agree with Mr. Francisco, and I, frankly, am going to have a hard time defending the financial aspect of this to people that ask me the question. But, Mr. White brought up the fact that we had this collaboration with Caltrans, which is, sometimes happens and sometimes doesn't happen, with due respect to Ms. Lowe. Sometimes it isn't always Camelot when it comes to dealing with the Caltrans. But recently, we did have quite a collaboration, quite a cooperative movement, perhaps in anticipation of this relinquishment. And in fact, Cliff Drive is now prepared for stability for the next 4 or 5 years going out in terms of its pavement condition and the things that we do have. Now, I agree, we don't know. We don't know what the costs are going to be, or in fact, where the money may or may not come from going forward. But one of the speakers did bring up that we are representing here with this inventory, less than 3% of our streets inventory, and this is basically brand new streets as of right now. Now, there are other things like the traffic lights and whatnot, but once again, as we anticipate things like Measure Y, roundabout, whatever we're going to do on Cliff Drive, it's going to be nice, I think, to be responsive to our population, to not have the extra layer of bureaucracy to deal with as we go forward and make the decisions that we do have. So I do move forward with in the respect of your points, Mr. Francisco, about the financing and the mysteries therein. But I do think in the grand scope of things, and the amount of money we do spend in streets, the amount of money we do go forward to spend in planning infrastructure, that this really makes the most sense for this community. Thank you.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just to, Ms. Maria, I don't want you to be disappointed, but if we go forward with this now, we're not going to be making any safety improvements for a long, long time. So don't think that, we say yes here, hey, we've solved the issue. We haven't even studied. We don't even know what it's going to cost. We don't know what it would be. We don't know anything. So going forward with a relinquishment does not solve the issues that all of these people rightly bring up and that we are concerned with. Mr. Wozniak, as I remember in our last Public Works report about roads, we said that our streets had dropped below the California standard still more. Is that correct or not?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, our city pavement condition index has dropped from a 75 level several years ago to a 68 level, which is actually above the state average of about 66.
Okay.
So we're slightly better off than the average in the state, but below a condition index of 70 is area of concern where maintenance costs of roads start to increase, and then they increase exponentially as they continue to decline.
Right. So here we are taking on a big stretch of road that's only going to further that very problem. And we said that we already do not have the money that we need to keep up with ourselves, if I can put it that way. That's what we said. Okay, so I guess we're saying we got a hole in our pocket, so let's make it a little bit bigger. And that makes no sense at all to me. I'm surprised that my fellow businessmen here are willing to even think in those terms. I understand the emotion here, But we're supposed to be adults in the room, and we've got to say, 2 and 2 equal 4, and when you take away 1, it doesn't go to 5, it goes to 3. This is important stuff. And we have other things. We're trying to keep our police force up. We're trying to open the library. We're trying to do improvements here and there, and we're saying, nope, sorry, we're going to do this instead, just because it feels good. And it doesn't change anything except become more expensive. I don't see the logic in that, and I would urge all of you here that have already said, well, I'm going to go for this, to reconsider, just for those reasons. Not because it's not the right thing to do, but it's not the right time to do the right thing. I think that's all I've got to say, but, it's just, unfortunately, it's really dollars and cents, and the condition of our city at large. Thank you all for listening.
I think about when Santa Barbara County voted for Measure A, which brings in the half-cent continuation sales tax for transportation projects. And every city and the county and SB-CAG has said the expansion of the 101 freeway, the HOV project, is the #1 highest regional transportation priority. And that's why we need to support Measure A, and it needs to happen. And, you go to SB-CAG meetings, it's always talked about. Measure A covers maybe a third of the cost of that HOV project. And we don't know today where all that money's coming from. We're talking $500 million on that one. But yet, because we have a plan, because we said it was a priority, because we went through the process with Measure A and got the funding and we're following through, we are now eligible for significant state and federal funds that we're starting to get that we never would have had we not said this is a priority, we need to move forward. Same thing with Lower Mission Creek. The flood control project there, we're talking $60 million, but yet because we have a plan, we went to the Coastal Commission, we didn't know where the money was going to come from for all those segments, but slowly through bridge funding, partly through redevelopment agency when we had it, through Union Pacific even in their portion of the area, the state funding for other bridge replacement that's happening. We're putting it together, and because of that now, the Army Corps of Engineers is looking at this much more intensely in terms of significant federal funding to make that happen. Had we not said 40 years ago, but really more recently, of moving that project forward, saying this is a priority, this is because of a variety of issues, we never did that, we wouldn't even know where to start to get the funding. I think this is very similar, different than undergrounding, which was a specific project that needed to move forward right away, that was kind of complete. This is a much bigger, broader scope and need to look at different sources of funding to make happen. But yet, if we stop now and say, we can stop now and say, forget it and we don't want to do it. That's one thing. That's a policy issue. But that's not the policy I think we agree upon. I think we're all agreeing that the policy needs to be towards a local street. So then the question is, how do you be successful doing it? And I think there are other regional big examples that are similar to this about how to actually get it done. So that's, I think, it's not a zero-sum game here. By moving forward, we are now opening up opportunities that we never thought of before because we weren't in a position to really get to that point. Okay, we do have a motion on the table. We have a couple more lights on. Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. One thing I want to say about this process, which I think I'm very grateful for, is our discussions with Caltrans. I think we've definitely moved things forward in a mutually agreeable direction. I'm very happy about that. And I think I realize that Mr. Wiley still has concerns, and if he has concerns, I have concerns. But I do think that we've met each other in a reasonable way on this, and there's been some give and take. And I appreciate the fact that we were actually, the Caltrans and staff worked together closely and actually came up with, I think, a reasonable compromise on this. As you all know, I don't think this is the right time to do this, and I don't think this is an all or nothing, that if we don't do it now, we'll never be able to do it again. I think Caltrans will be quite happy to get rid of this obligation in 5 years. And I hope, I think people, at least in this room, who've been here and who've heard this discussion today, realize that the actual public safety improvements are likely a long ways off. But nevertheless, it's clear that the council is deciding to move forward with this project. I would ask that after we vote on this, that we also vote on going forward with the study project to look at the pedestrian safety improvements so that we go forward with a better, clearer sense of what's going to be required to actually make the public safety improvements that we want on Cliff Drive.
I believe that's in the motion with the work plan, so that's part of the motion.
It is part of the motion. Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, Mr. Hotchkiss isn't wrong about that, and I am part of the business community, and I do make decisions from time to time that aren't just dollar and cents based for a variety of reasons, and maybe that's why I still have to work today. I'll never retire, but I do make those decisions nonetheless. But and also, you mentioned a couple of things, Mr. Hotchkiss, about libraries and whatnot, which, of course, don't relate to this because they're not, these are streets funds, and they're not going to be general fund burden projects. But I'll go back to the thing about local control and jurisdictions, because there is, to be as enmeshed in this community, you know, City College is a tremendous resource, a tremendous facility. We have no control over it. We have no control over its growth, its traffics, or its impact on our neighborhoods. There's not a whole lot we're going to do about that today. But there are things we can do today. We can move towards 225 and have that back in our control. And that's kind of my point. I mean, I maybe can't point out and quantify it and put in specifics, but I have to tell you that it makes a lot of sense when your neighbors and your constituents come to you and ask for X, Y, and Z, and you're not just shrugging your shoulders saying, sorry, not my job, not my purview, not my jurisdiction. And I do believe that because of the dynamics of that neighborhood, whatever that road was designed for in the beginning, whether it was to service the oil fields or whatever the anticipated needs were, is not the reality of today. And I think we've already changed that dynamic somewhat with Caltrans's help in doing the restriping. But I really believe that going forward, the self-determination, wherever and whenever we can get it, is really important. And that's why I'm going to support the motion.
Okay, so the motion's for item number 2, and it's been moved and seconded, plenty of discussion, so all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
No.
I believe that's 5-2. Okay, thank you. I want to thank Ms. Lowe again for coming down, and Ms. Blackerby from Assembly Member's Office, and this meeting's adjourned.